Oh, we're checking everybody. It is another edition of Orange Bloods TV, Orange Bloods YouTube, as a matter of fact. I'm Geoff Ketchum, joined today by Anwar Richardson, as we do from time to time here on this channel, to talk some Texas football today, talking some Texas football recruiting. If you like the conversation, hit the subscribe button. If you like today's video, well, you know what to do. Hit that little thumbs up button, and you'll be doing us a solid. Anwar, you and I have had the conversation this year in 2021 about the Texas recruiting situation at quarterback, right? I mean, we've had the Maalik Murphy, Quinn Ewers, Cade Klubnik. To some degree, even Connor Weigman falls into the conversation as well, simply because it's such a stacked year in the state of Texas at the quarterback position. It's been a while since we've had the conversation, though. We haven't done it on YouTube yet. And given that Malik Murphy has now finished his junior season, albeit on a completely unique and different track than any other quarterback in his profile, I think, has ever had to deal with in the history of college football recruiting, I think it's time to revisit the conversation because it's not going to go away. And I think when we get into the fall, we will see the conversation really spike again when we see Maalik Murphy, Cade Klubnik, and Quinn Ewers go through their senior seasons. It makes for a fascinating backdrop to a season that we're already greatly anticipating, just because the thought process, it will be a bit of a return to normalcy. Crowds in the stands, football will feel like football again, and we will be watching these kids go through their senior season in high school in a way that I can't remember doing in a really long time at this level.
Yeah, because there will be a direct comparison. Like, that's what it will be, direct, because it's almost like, okay, who's got their dog? Like, and it's like, all right, Cade Klubnik is going to Clemson, but he's from Westlake. He's right around the corner, and people can debate whether he would or would not have ever come to Texas. But and because of the A&M roots, I interviewed Klubnik previously. He said, like, he tried to tell me like that would never play a factor, in his decision. And he was one of the first people that Sarkisian followed on Twitter and went after. Then there was Quinn Ewers, and that's the guy who had decommitted from previously last year, and there was a belief amongst Texas fans that when Sarkisian got back, that he would just flip from Ohio State and come back to Texas. That hasn't happened. Clearly doesn't look like that's going to happen. And then there's Malik Murphy, and the thing about Malik that's interesting is this: of all the quarterbacks in this class, the one guy who's probably the most unproven is Malik Murphy. And you could go off the 7-on-7. And you can talk about what he does. You can talk about how he looks. But from a high school productivity standpoint, he still is unproven. There still is some risk reward that's associated with him. And I know it comes with any quarterback, Catch, but there really isn't, Catch, when you think about it. There isn't much of a precedent for saying there was a quarterback in high school who really never put up a ton of great numbers and then all of a sudden emerge into a star in college. Like, you might go to the top, the Kyle Trask, situation, and maybe that's what you can point to at the University of Florida. But there is not a whole lot. So, like, the whole unknown with Malik, and everyone was watching his games this year, to have the unknown plus the comparisons with the proven guys, I think it puts a lot of pressure on Malik, to be honest with you.
The fact that these kids assume monumental loads of pressure on their shoulders. But, if you're going to be the quarterback at Texas, if you're going to be the quarterback at Clemson or Ohio State, this somewhat comes with the territory. I have so many thoughts on Maalik Murphy. I have so many thoughts on all of these quarterbacks, and we'll get into each of them as we kind of discuss where we stand, our thoughts on all three. But Maalik Murphy, he's a bit of a unicorn in a lot of ways. I can't point to anybody that I can ever remember seeing in the last 25 years that completely fits his profile. I think that we have to almost go to a bygone era where kids would play in running offenses and then show up on campus and you just didn't know they had certain kinds of abilities. But in this passing game era that we live in now, where everybody throws the ball and every quarterback has 4,000 yards, it feels like the opposite is almost always true. These guys come in with these pinball numbers in terms of passing game stats, and you try to tell people, 15,000 yards doesn't translate to automatically being a success at the next level. And yet with Maalik Murphy, it's a different kind of problem. There's almost two ways you have to look at Maalik Murphy. There's Maalik Murphy, the player, and then there's Maalik Murphy, the prospect. And I think Maalik Murphy, the player, is a guy that is still significantly developing in ways that I think are probably different than Cade Klubnik and Quinn Ewers. Significantly different. Those guys right now are 5-star players. They're guys that take their teams to the state championship game. They're the type of guys that put their team on their shoulders. They have the great numbers. The question then becomes, are they 5-star prospects? And I think with both of those players, we're splitting hairs oftentimes in terms of those who like them the most versus those that don't. It's always in that type of conversation. Sure. Maalik Murphy may be a 3-star player with a 5-star prospect set of tools. And it's just, it's hard for me to point, me. I like to find comparisons and go, he kind of reminds me of this guy. The only guy that I can really compare him to, and I hate the comparison, is Tyrone Swoops, mainly because you watch Swoops throw the football, and at his best, he could look like a 5-tool kind of a guy. But nobody ever talked about Swoops the way they talk about Maalik Murphy in terms of watching this guy throw the football. One of my guys in LA, Beto Duran, went and watched him play late in his junior season and said he was everything that he had heard he was, and that he had seemingly all the intangibles, and he was buying Maalik Murphy's stock. And I thought, okay, well, that's a good endorsement, because I know Beto Duran, and I know who he sees, but it's still impossible at the end of the season to look at his final numbers and to come away with this guy belongs in the same conversation with a guy like Cade Klubnik or Quinn Ewers. He just doesn't. Those guys are in different stratospheres right now on the field with what they're achieving. The question is, can Maalik Murphy catch up to them and pass them at the next level? And it is a concept and a theory that feels a bit unproven right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at his numbers from, it looks like this season, if it's correct, it was 1,261 passing yards, 9 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, and looks like he was 90 of 163, averaging about 210 a game as far as passing yards are concerned. So you just look at it and you go, okay. I mean, the stats are there. And it's tough because when you start looking at it, I thought what you said was really interesting, prospect versus player, because when you look at the other guys, Cade Klubnik, Quinn Ewers, we know bona fide ballers. I mean, ballers, each one of them. And I think you and I are on the same page where we probably go Klubnik just a little bit higher than yours. And, we've talked about this before, not on this channel, but people have said, well, you shouldn't factor so much the state championship game into it as far as the assessment goes. And I'm like, well, you kind of should, right? You should factor in how two people perform on the biggest stage. And Klubnik was balling in that state championship game. He just was. And Quinn Ewers had a little bit more difficulty. It is not to say Quinn's not good. Like, don't get me wrong. But we clearly looked at it that day and we're like, that's the best quarterback on the field for that moment. But then the problem becomes, an issue becomes, especially when you start thinking of a University of Texas catch. The thing is, the biggest difficulty that most of these coaches at the University of Texas has had, probably since you've been here, and probably especially since Colt, is really finding, for lack of better terms, the franchise quarterback. Those years after Colt, were just a lot of coin toss years, and a lot of just kind of getting through and getting by kind of years. And then, you get past David Ash and the injury, and then there's a Tyrone Swoops, and there's Gerard Hurd, and that kind of feels a little bit. And then there was Shane Buechele, and it was okay as a freshman, but it really never really progressed past that. And then there was Sam, and Sam was arguably one of the best quarterbacks since Cole. But Texas has still been looking for that. And so what's interesting now, when they have a guy who is still working on it to become a player, it is more of a, maybe a great prospect. Is he the only quarterback that Steve Sarkisian takes? Does he need to go ahead and get another person in this class as some insurance? Is it okay if he says, no matter if Casey Thompson leaves or Hudson Card leaves, I still can develop this guy, and I still got a guy. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's a thought process of, does he need an insurance? Does he need backup just in case? Because it's a little bit of a gamble. As great of a quarterback coach as Sarkisian is, it's still a little bit of a gamble.
I'm going to come to Maalik Murphy's defense a little bit here, because I think at the end of the day, if you offered me a 5-star prospect or a 5-star player at the next level, I'd rather have the prospect than the player more times than not. And while people can point to the success, they can point to a guy like Colt McCoy and say, that guy was just a player. Colt McCoy, from a statistical standpoint, was 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000. I don't know. Like, when you take into what he accomplished versus where he came from, he fit a profile that we had never seen before. Like, there'd never been a guy with his profile had the success that he had, and he was the first. Maalik Murphy has physical tools. Maalik Murphy is the highest rated quarterback commitment that the Longhorns have had since Garrett Gilbert. So while you were mentioning all of the names about how Texas has been lacking elite level quarterback prospects, and they have, Murphy is, even with all of the various opinions on him, he ranks as the highest rated quarterback prospect currently. Now, maybe it changes. Maybe he goes up, maybe he goes down, maybe it doesn't stay the way that it started. But when he committed, Maalik Murphy's the highest rated quarterback prospect that Texas has had since Garrett Gilbert in the class of 2009. That's a long time ago. This kid's 2022. There's like an entire decade that went by without someone of this magnitude. From just a flat out measurables and skills standpoint, Maalik Murphy, I think it's easy to see why Sarkisian is really interested in him. I think what's really interesting about Maalik Murphy is that I think he knows that he is not ready to play. So there's a patience that he seems to be indicating that he's willing to have, and a commitment to baking in the oven, if you will, until the cake is ready to come out, that I think is really crucial for him, because most guys with his recruiting profile, if they're not playing in year 1 or year 2, are out the door. I think it may be, and I always thought the thing that really got Tyrone Swoops was that he was forced to play before he ever really had a chance to learn. That kid came from an impossibly small classification of Texas high school football, and then was thrust into a position where Mack Brown burned his red shirt out of selfish, desperate reasons. And then he falls under a coach in Charlie Strong, who has to play him, ready or not. Here he comes. That won't happen to Maalik Murphy, we don't think, right? Whatever we think is going to happen at the quarterback position, unless there's a transfer and or multiple injuries, Maalik Murphy may be in a situation where he does get to sit for a year or two at the University of Texas, and it may be exactly what he needs. It's funny, though, because I think about how critical I am, nitpicking, if you will, when I talk about Quinn Ewers, because one of my nitpicks of Ewers is just kind of how he handles chaos when he doesn't have a clean pocket, which he does a lot of the time at South Lake Carroll, most of the time. He's just playing pitch and catch with receivers, and it's a different game than he'll play at the collegiate level. Even at a Clemson, where or excuse me, at an Ohio State where he might batter a team one week, they're still going to have games where he's made to feel uncomfortable. And I just have question marks of college football in high school is a different game because it's larger human beings moving faster, and it just gets more complicated at the quarterback position. And when we saw what we saw from Ewers in the state championship game against Westlake was they were able to create chaos on him. I mean, by the time that game was over, supporters of South Lake Carroll were trying to call the Austin Westlake defense the best defense in the history of high school football. They were really good.
Yeah.
But none of those kids are as talented or well coached as the kids you'll see at the next level, right? Everybody will be bigger, faster, stronger. They will get close to him. And so there's this question mark I have for Ewers, which is in the pocket, under pressure, how does he respond in general as a player? Now, I think that's a criticism that you can have of basically every high school quarterback. Ironically, the thing that I liked most about Sam Ehlinger when he was a high school prospect is I thought he hung in the pocket, threw in the pocket, in the face of pressure really well. Probably better in high school than he did in college, which speaks to how different the games are. But when we talk about Ewers, this is a really specific and nitpick of sorts. It's like, oh, you do all of these other things good. I have this one question mark, and I've got the kid rated as a 5-star player, but there is a degree of, I don't know, I still have a bit of a question mark with him. But I think it's true of every quarterback.
Sure.
But with Maalik Murphy, there's a legitimate, can he play? Right? So I'm nitpicking a guy who's elite at his position on this really minute detail that will be really important at the next level. But I don't think to myself, can he walk and chew bubblegum at the same time as a college football player? I absolutely believe his floor is minimal. Maalik Murphy's floor is just different than a guy like Klubnik and Ewers. And I think that that's the thing that scares Texas fans is that these other two guys, at worst, they'll be pretty good. I think Quinn Ewers can go to a Texas Tech or something like that, and he'd put up 12,000 career yards and be all Big 12. But the question is, will he be elite of the elite? Cade Klubnik, I think he'll go to, and the question there is he the best that Clemson's ever going to be able to get? Because those schools are recruiting at levels where next year's Cade Klubnik will also come in. And sometimes these guys lose battles. Like this kid, Drew Sanders, that's a linebacker at Alabama. I was talking to an Alabama guy yesterday about him because there had been some conversation that he might be a transfer candidate. He's really good. Alabama people think he can play in the NFL. The problem is he's behind one of the best linebackers in college football and a senior. And so he's just, it's hard to play at Alabama. If you can crack through, you're going to play in the NFL. But if you don't crack through, it's because really elite level possible NFL talent is in front of you. And that's what those two guys are going to have to deal with. Maalik Murphy's basement is just lower than both of them. And we can talk about his ceiling all we want to, but there's just a scary question about him that's a bit unusual for guys who are ranked as national top 50 to 100 guys.
The scary thing is, too, when you use the Swoops example, that his team, as his senior year, they won one game. They're 1-9. And so how did somehow magically expecting that to how somewhat translate to college success, in hindsight, was asking a lot. In hindsight, it was not so much. So now,
without any development at all.
Correct.
They just put him on the field and said, go.
Correct. Absolutely. So then you have that. And so again, we'll see. I think the good benefit is Maalik Murphy, to your point, will have a senior season that should be back to normal, where we should be able to see him and start getting some progression and kind of going from there. You should be able to say, all right, starting to see it, starting to make sense. But let me ask you this. Today, as it stands, as we're recording this, what's today? As we record
May
this,
12th.
May 12th. 2021. Okay. And someone will put it in the archives. As of right now, of the three, which quarterback do you think will have the most success in college?
Define success.
Okay. Conference championship. So let's talk about leading this team to the most conference championships. Potentially.
I mean, it's either Klubnik or Ewers. It's just one of the two. They're both. My question for both of those guys will simply be, are they going to beat out the other 5 stars that they'll have to compete against? I don't know that I view them both as 5 stars. And if they enter a situation where they're clearly the guy, I think they're both NFL football players in 4 years.
Okay.
Now, which one has the most conference championships? I mean, Clemson and Ohio State might both win 4 or 5 over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. I think Ewers is the guy that I think will put up the best numbers. Klubnik's the guy that I would want being as my quarterback.
Okay.
So it's hard for me to separate those two things because I think if you put Cade Klubnik on Westlake, I think Westlake wins the championship last year. And I think if you put him on South Lake Carroll, they do as well. That's who I think Cade Klubnik is. People can disagree with me and say, no, it was all deep. Go back and watch the game. Go back and watch that state championship game and watch the special little moments that he had in the biggest spotlight of his life. Both he and Quinn Ewers, it's the biggest game that either of them have ever played in up until this point in their lives. In every other sport, that matters. In boxing, it matters who you fight and how you fight when you fight the best. I mean, Money Mayweather's entire career is somewhat noted by the fact that he wasn't in a lot of those fights. The NBA is defined by how you perform in the playoffs. The Greek Freak has won back-to-back MVPs, hasn't done it in the playoffs, and people have basically said, yeah, he ain't winning another MVP, and we really aren't going to pay a ton of attention to him until he does it in the playoffs. Clayton Kershaw, right? I mean, He finally got his justice in the postseason, but this is a guy who's one of the best pitchers of all time. How he performed in the postseason has defined who he is. Troy Aikman is the number 1 guy on Fox because he has 3 rings on his finger. Tom Brady's the unquestioned all-time best quarterback because he got all the Super Bowl rings. Like, winning and how you perform in the biggest games matter. My expectations of that game coming in were that Klubnik would be great, and he was. And I think Quinn Ewers was really freaking good, but he wasn't great. And we're talking about really narrow margins with those 2 players. I don't think Malik Murphy is on their level. The question is, with his skill set and with elite level coaching, could he get there in college? I absolutely believe that, but I don't know if that's confirmation bias on my part or wishful thinking, or because I like Malik. So, I can't point to a lot of situations and say, well, look at this. It's exactly the same. It can be done. And I'm typically a guy that if something hasn't been done, I need to see it first before I buy into it conceptually that it can happen. So I'm a bit of a hypocrite / conflicting set of ideas with it relating to Malik Murphy, but I would absolutely take him as my quarterback in this class. If I had to take just one, and I couldn't get Klubnik and I couldn't get Ewers, and it's, do I take a B-level quarterback from the state of Texas, or do I take this kid from California with just a different set of tools to work with at the next position? I'll take the guy with the elite set of tools, even if it's a huge gamble. I think what Texas has to do at this point, they have to hit next year's quarterback out of the box. So they put themselves into a position where they've got more than one option. What can't happen is what just happened, which is Charles Wright commits in this class, and he's the only quarterback you end up landing. And I think he could end up being a completely fine college football player. but it's hard for me to think that he's going to end up being elite of the elite. So you just win a class where I don't know that you signed a guy who's going to set statistical records and lead you to a championship. With all due respect to Charles Wright, like I'm rooting for him as well, but I didn't rate him as that kind of a player. And I can't pretend because he's a local guy that's changed my mind. If you sign Maalik Murphy in this class, it really becomes pivotal because you run the risk of doing what Texas has done for the last decade, putting all your eggs in one basket. And that basket's not made necessarily to handle all the eggs being in it. And if you're Steve Sarkisian and you don't do that, your tenure in Austin can get really rocky before it ever has a chance to get off the ground. Now, maybe that doesn't happen because maybe you've got Hudson Card and Casey Thompson to build that bridge. But what follows them is right now a quarterback depth chart that brings more questions than answers.
Yeah. So that one of the last things I was going to ask you, and was the exact same thing. So you and I want to say wavelength. We obviously assume, and rightfully so, that if Casey Thompson loses the job in August, he's out. You know, he transfers. He's got 3 years of eligibility remaining. Even if he goes and transfers to another school in August, he'll say, all right, I'll sit out this year because I'm not playing anyway. So I'll just get to the school and program that I need to get into and then be able to hit the ground running, you know, come January. Okay. So then it really becomes, when I start thinking of it, it's really about Hudson Card at that point, right? Because I'm starting thinking, let's say Hudson Card stays, okay? You know, because we assume Casey would leave, but we don't know if Hudson would leave. So Hudson Card is technically a sophomore, technically how they do that. And so from that point on, Ketch, he's got this year as he's a sophomore. Maalik Murphy hits campus next year. That would be Hudson Card's junior. And then Hudson Card would have his senior season. So there would be theoretically 2 years or so where Maalik Murphy sits, doesn't play, has an opportunity to learn. So if the thought process is he's sitting for 2 years, he's going to redshirt 1 year, he's got another year. So by the time he's a redshirt sophomore, potentially he's ready to go. If that's the plan, that would seem to be what it would be, then yes, then he's got 2 years of sitting, developing, coaching, and then the player, even if he's not a player, the prospect then becomes the college player, being able to sit and learn. I think that's his benefit because you talked about Swoops was thrown in without a life preserver. Maalik Murphy, though, gets to sit for a couple of years before there's any expectation that's put on him. And then, of course, we would assume in that process that there would be some other quarterbacks that he would bring in, Sarkisian would bring in order to compete at that point.
Well, I think that a transfer always looms as – it's funny, you can look through the portal right now. Even this year, there are players with proven college football bona fides that don't have schools. It kind of reminds me of the NFL free agency market where you have that big rush and then and then guys wait until after the draft.
Yeah.
And sometimes guys wait till close to training camp. And you definitely see it at the quarterback position, right? It's like, who needs a quarterback? And sometimes the guys that are most available are waiting to see if there's an injury. They're waiting to see if somebody gets, whatever it is that shakes up. I think there's a little bit of that in the quarterback market right now where you have guys. I'll give you an example. There's a guy named Chris Robinson who was the starting quarterback at Florida Atlantic last year, put up good numbers. I think he transferred thinking that he'd make that upgrade, go to a big time program because he started at Oklahoma. Transfers to Florida Atlantic. He's a former national top 100. He was, in a lot of people's estimations, the best quarterback in Sam Ehlinger's senior class.
Okay, yeah.
I thought Ehlinger was best, at least on that one. I've so far proven to be right. But that's his background. Former guy from the state of Texas. He's still in the portal. Can't find a starting job. It seems like he's waiting it out. I think whether it's late or even if we're talking about next year, there will be guys in the portal that I think Texas could get as a backup option if they needed it. Guys that have started elsewhere, have experience, aren't complete bums, but aren't really at the level of starting at a major college program or kind of hoping for that shot. Like, I think that will be available to Texas, that if it's ever needed, gives a guy like Murphy, right? Because the question is, well, what happens if one guy transfers and it's Hudson Card stays and then he gets hurt? And then it's either Charles Wright or Maalik Murphy, at which point maybe Malik Murphy has to play. I think Texas would be able to protect themselves in that situation in a short-term gap, the way an NFL team would, right? You wouldn't sign a guy in August and say, he's going to be our starter for the next 5 years. But sometimes you sign a guy in August because maybe at some point during the season, you need a guy for a couple of games. And I think those types of guys can be found in the portal. And I think they'll be Malik Murphy's best friend. Because if you tell me right now that Malik Murphy can take 2 full seasons of learning under Steve Sarkisian before he's asked to do any heavy lifting, I like his chances of success significantly more than I would if he were going to another situation where the expectations would be play earlier. And it's weird because most guys with his recruiting profile rated that highly don't go to situations where they have to wait a long time. I think this is the best spot for him. My last question to you will be,
okay,
if you're Texas, you still go after Quinn Ewers all day long, right? I mean, you have to. And because he is a higher grade prospect than Malik Murphy. And I think if we were, we could be, if you didn't get Bijan Robinson earlier, you'd still chase him. You'd still, all the way to the finish line, you'd try. And I think as much as I like Malik Murphy as a prospect, if you're Texas and you can upgrade, I think you'd try. I think it would be it would be harsh on Malik if we get into November-ish, let's say, and they're still looking for I wonder how they handle that, because up until now, Malik Murphy's been the most loyal, committed guy in the Texas recruiting class. And I think Texas is showing him that love back. But this Quinn Ewers thing is never going to go away. He's got a little bit of a Paul Bunyan, Johnny Appleseed legend about him.
Yeah.
And look, rightfully so. He's really effing good, right? Like
he's a baller.
Top 2 or 3 prospect in the state of Texas, which means he's a top 25 kid in the nation.
Yes.
But I think it would be an act of betrayal if you're Texas. You'd be stabbing Malik in the back a little bit. And it happens. Quick story. Texas once got a quarterback commitment. This is so funny because of the name I'm going to mention. Jefferson Sneed signed with Texas in 2006. He came in to battle Colt McCoy for the starting job and lost it. But before he came to Texas, he was a committed quarterback for a long time at Florida. But Florida had this other kid in state that they kept telling Jefferson Sneed, we're recruiting him as an athlete. If we get him, he's not going to play quarterback for us. Occasionally there'd be photos of the kid's dad and Urban Meyer on a golf cart together. There'd be pictures of this kid at camp, and the conversation never went away. And late in the year, Florida ends up getting a commitment from this kid, and Jefferson Sneed said, you guys lied to me. I'm out. And he signs with Texas. Guess who the kid was?
Who's that?
Tim Tebow. Once upon a time, Tim Tebow was this unicorn as a high school football player, and Florida was telling other kids, we don't even think he's good enough to play quarterback for us. But Jefferson Sneed understood once that guy committed to Florida, there was a hopelessness behind what it meant for his future as a quarterback there. He ended up being right. He ended up making the right decision and getting the hell out of there. The only thing that got in Jefferson Sneed's way, I think, of that situation working is he chose a school at Texas that appeared to have an open depth chart, and he ran into a guy competing for a job that ends up getting his number retired. That's just bad luck. But these things happen in Florida. And here's the thing. Has anybody ever brought up the stabbing in the back of Jefferson Sneed?
Nope.
Anytime anybody's ever talked about Tim Tebow or Urban Meyer?
Tim Tebow, no. I mean, he's a legend. He's viewed as one of the greatest college quarterbacks ever. I know people would say Vince, but I mean, there will be people will say Vince versus Tebow, and you can have a healthy conversation. I've never heard the story until today. Exactly. And by the way, props to Jevin for getting on the internet, because I lived in Florida at that point. Tim Tebow was a freaking quarterback legend.
Yes.
When he was in high school. Like,
Urban was
lying to him.
Urban was like, we're not recruiting him as a quarterback. And then Jefferson Sneed would get on like the Florida Rivals site, and there's a picture of Tim Tebow's old man on the front page with Urban Meyer, and Jevin was like, I don't know about all this.
Let me tell you, there have been guys like in high school in certain states where they're just the man, the myth, and legend. In Florida, Tebow was like the man, the myth, the legend in high school. I saw him play in the state championship game against, I believe it was Armwood High School or Plant. I forget which one it was. I watched him in person. It's the first time, and I had heard he was a baller. He was a baller. So yes, props to you, Jevin. So to your point.
By the way, rest in peace, Jefferson Sneed. I don't want to have this. You don't know this. There'd be no reason for you to know that Jefferson Sneed is no longer with us, but because he's a former Texas player and because we're kind of talking about his situation and he did pass away, I just don't want to be disrespectful about it. But yes, Jefferson Sneed was Anwar. He was one of the original smart guy internet users. Mm-hmm. You're right.
Yeah.
You go back to 2006 and college. It's funny. That was, we'll wrap this thing up, but that was back in an era when college coaches in all sports lied to kids religiously. Oh, yeah. And then the internet turned into this fact checker where, if you tell a kid something, he's going to tell a reporter. Yes. And then that reporter is going to print it. And there's a former Texas basketball coach that comes to mind, but he used to lie to assistant coach, used to lie to kids all the time. And then it would get reported.
Yeah.
And then he would call up and be like, why are you doing that to me? And I was like, you're doing this to yourself. You're doing this to yourself.
Can I give you one good one?
Know what your lies are in advance so we can protect you, or you have to run the chances that if you're just telling some kid some bullshit, he might say it out loud. And Jefferson Sneed was one of the first guys with the help of the internet that was like, I don't know about this whole Tim Tebow to tight end, ironically enough. All these years later, Urban Meyer, 15 years later, is finally making that Tim Tebow to tight end move that he told Jefferson Sneed about all those years ago.
So let me tell you one quick story. I'll this will be the last thing I'll say post internet, right? It's a good story. So many moons ago, there's a coach down in used to be at Florida Southern. His name is Gordon Gibbons. He told me the story. So there was a kid that this community college down in the Tampa Bay area was recruiting, right, for basketball, right? And they fly the kid in, and they showed him the University of South Florida basketball arena and told him that this is where he would be playing. And they start showing him around different places and different things on campus. And he's like, wow, this is great. Like, I absolutely love this. He commits. So then when he actually comes to go to school, they pick him up from the airport and they drive past University of South Florida and actually take him an hour to actually where he was. That's how the lies used to be.
It must be a Florida thing, because Florida State's MO back in the day used to be bring the players in, let them go party at Florida A&M.
Yes.
And then the kids would come back and be like, Florida State is awesome. And, half of their success probably needs to be chalked up to
Florida A&M. Absolutely.
Very smart ploy. If you I don't hate the player, hate the game. There's apparently a lot of gamesmanship in Florida. Anyway, look, for myself and Anwar Richardson, this ended up being a lot more fun than I thought it would be. I enjoyed story time today, Anwar. I really did. Like the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to hear more. We'll do this again later, like in a day or two. Talk to you soon.